Hey there, friends! Welcome back to Botanic Haven, your cozy little corner of the internet where we talk about growing plants, making our gardens and balconies beautiful, and turning even the tiniest windowsill into a green paradise. I'm so happy you're here, whether you're a total beginner or someone who's been gardening for years. This is the place where we share real, simple tips that actually work in real life, not just in fancy gardening books. Today, I want to talk about something that really hit me in the heart when I first learned about it. A plant that, just 100 years ago, entire villages lived on, cooked with, and even traded like gold. And now, most people are told it's just a useless weed that needs to be ripped out and thrown away. Honestly, it breaks my heart a little every time I see it. So let's start with a story. A few years ago, I was visiting my friend Daisy in the countryside. She's one of those amazing people who still remembers how her grandmother used to cook, how she'd forage for greens in the fields, and how nothing ever went to waste. We were walking through an old meadow near her house and she suddenly stopped, bent down and picked a small, unassuming plant with jagged leaves and tiny yellow flowers. "Look at this," she said with a smile. "This little thing, my grandma used to call it poor man's spinach. She'd cook it with onions, garlic and a bit of butter, and it was delicious. She said back in her day, this plant was a lifesaver when food was scarce." I looked at it and thought, wait, that's just a weed. But Daisy just laughed and said, "It's only a weed if you don't know what to do with it." That moment stuck with me. I started digging into old gardening books, talking to older gardeners, and even visiting a few rural communities where people still remember the old ways. And what I found was shocking. So many plants that we now treat as weeds were once essential food sources, medicines, and even cash crops for entire villages. They were dried, stored, traded, and passed down from generation to generation. People didn't just tolerate them, they valued them. They knew exactly when to harvest them, how to prepare them, and which parts were safe to eat. And now, we're told to spray them with chemicals, pull them out by the roots, and throw them in the bin as if they're nothing but trash. One of the most common examples is dandelion. Yes, that bright yellow flower that pops up in lawns everywhere. Most people see it and think, ugh, another weed to get rid of. But go back just 100 years and dandelions were a staple in many diets. People would gather the young leaves in spring, cook them like spinach, or even ferment them into wine. The roots were roasted and used as a coffee substitute during hard times. In some places, dandelion roots were even sold in markets. And today, we spend money on expensive superfood greens while pulling out a plant that's free, nutritious, and grows almost everywhere. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. Another plant that fascinates me is plantain, not the banana-like fruit, but the common weed with broad leaves that grows in paths and lawns. I remember my neighbour Oliver, an old gardener with hands full of scars and a heart full of stories. He once told me, "When I was a boy, we called this nature's Band-Aid. If you got a cut or a sting, you'd just pick a fresh plantain leaf, chew it a bit, and slap it on the wound. It helped stop the bleeding and took the sting away." He still uses it today, and honestly, I've tried it myself. It's not magic, but it really does seem to calm down small cuts and insect bites. And yet, most modern gardeners see plantain as nothing more than an ugly weed that ruins the perfect lawn. Then there's chickweed. If you've ever had a garden, you've probably seen it. A soft, low-growing plant with tiny white flowers that spreads like crazy. Many gardeners hate it because it competes with their precious flowers and vegetables. But in the past, chickweed was considered a valuable green. It's rich in vitamins, tender and delicious in salads or cooked like spinach. In some regions, it was even fed to chickens and other animals to keep them healthy. Now, we're told to spray it, pull it, and never let it near our proper garden beds. But here's the thing, if you learn to manage it instead of fighting it, chickweed can actually be a great companion plant. It helps keep the soil moist, suppresses other, nastier weeds, and can be harvested regularly as a nutritious green. I think part of the problem is that we've lost touch with the old knowledge. 100 years ago, people didn't have supermarkets on every corner. They couldn't just order exotic greens online, they had to rely on what grew around them. In their gardens, in the fields, along the roads. They learned which plants were safe, which parts to eat, and how to prepare them. That knowledge was passed down from mothers to daughters, from grandfathers to grandsons. But over time, as food became more industrialized and gardens became more decorative, that knowledge started to fade. We began to see wild plants not as food or medicine, but as enemies of the perfect lawn or the tidy flower bed. And that's where we need to change our mindset. Instead of asking, how do I get rid of this weed? We should start asking, what can I do with this plant? Because more often than not, that weed is actually a useful, even valuable plant that just needs a little respect and a bit of know-how. Take nettles, for example. Most people avoid them like the plague because of the sting. But once you learn how to handle them, wear gloves, harvest the young tops, and cook or dry them, nettles become one of the most nutritious greens you can grow. They're packed with iron, vitamins, and protein. In many cultures, nettle soup was a springtime tradition, and nettle tea was a common home remedy. Today, we're more likely to buy expensive supplements than to cook a simple nettle soup from our own garden. Another plant that surprises people is purslane. It's that succulent-looking weed with thick, juicy leaves that often grows in cracks in the pavement or between paving stones. Many gardeners pull it out without a second thought. But purslane is actually considered a superfood in many parts of the world. It's rich in omega-3 fatty acids, antioxidants, and vitamins. In Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cuisines, it's used in salads, stews, and even pickled. I once met a gardener named Rose who told me she used to grow purslane on purpose in her vegetable patch. People would laugh at me, she said, but I'd tell them this is free food and it's healthier than half the stuff in the supermarket. Now she teaches workshops on edible weeds, and more people are starting to see purslane not as a weed, but as a gift from the garden. Even common grasses can be useful. I know it sounds strange. Grass as food. But in many traditional cultures, certain wild grasses were harvested for their seeds, which were ground into flour or used in porridge. Today, we grow lawns purely for decoration, but in the past, a well-tended meadow could provide both food for animals and grain for people. And let's not forget clover, red clover, white clover. They're often seen as invaders in lawns, but they're actually nitrogen fixers that enrich the soil. They also attract bees and other pollinators, and their flowers can be used to make tea or even syrup. In some places, clover was even used as a cover crop to improve soil fertility between main crops. Now we often spray clover out of our lawns just to keep them pure grass, not realizing we're killing a plant that actually helps the soil. So, how do we start changing our relationship with these plants? First, we need to slow down and really look at what's growing in our gardens, on our balconies, or even in the cracks of the pavement. Instead of automatically reaching for the weed killer, take a moment to identify the plant. Is it dandelion, plantain, chickweed, nettle, purslane? Once you know what it is, you can decide whether it's something you can use, rather than something you must destroy. There are plenty of simple plant identification apps and books that can help, and many of them are designed for beginners. You don't need to be a botanist, just curious and willing to learn. Next, think about how you can use these plants. Are the leaves edible? Can they be cooked, added to salads, or used in soups? Are the flowers pretty enough to use in decorations or as garnishes? Can the roots or leaves be dried for tea? Even if you don't want to eat them, many of these plants make excellent compost material or mulch. Instead of throwing them in the bin, chop them up and add them to your compost pile. They'll break down quickly and enrich your soil, giving back to your garden what they took from it. And if you have chickens or other small animals, some of these plants can be great additions to their diet. Another important step is learning safe harvesting practices. Not every wild plant is safe to eat, and some look very similar to toxic ones. Always make sure you're 100% sure of the plant's identity before consuming it. Harvest from clean areas, not from roadsides with heavy traffic, not from places that might have been sprayed with chemicals, and not from areas where pets or wild animals frequently leave waste. The safest rule is, if in doubt, leave it out. And when in doubt, cook it. Cooking can destroy many harmful compounds and make some plants safer to eat. But again, this only works if you know the plant is edible in the first place. I also encourage you to experiment in small steps. Start with something simple and well-known, like dandelion leaves in a salad or nettle soup. Try drying plantain leaves for a simple herbal tea. Make a small batch of chickweed pesto or add purslane to your next stir-fry. See how you like it. If it doesn't work for you, that's okay. Not every plant suits every palate, but at least you've tried and you've learned something new. And who knows, you might discover a new favorite ingredient that's free, fresh, and growing right outside your door. One thing I've noticed is that once people start seeing these weeds as useful plants, their whole garden changes. They become more relaxed about perfection. They stop stressing about every little green sprout that pops up in the wrong place. Instead, they start looking at their garden as a living, breathing ecosystem where different plants have different roles. Some are for beauty, some for food, some for soil health, and some for medicine. And that shift in mindset is powerful. It makes gardening less about control and more about cooperation with nature. Take my friend Ivy, for example. She used to be a perfectionist gardener. Everything had to be neat, tidy, and proper. But after learning about edible and useful weeds, she started letting some of them grow in certain areas of her garden. She created a small, wild corner where dandelions, plantain, and chickweed could thrive. She harvests from it regularly, uses the plants in her kitchen, and even shares them with neighbours. Her garden is still beautiful, but it's also more alive, more diverse, and more connected to the natural world. And honestly, she's happier because of it. Another friend, Lucas, took it a step further. He turned part of his lawn into a no-mow zone where wild plants are allowed to grow. He mows only the paths and the main sitting area, but the rest is left to nature. He's amazed at how many bees, butterflies, and other insects have returned. He harvests edible plants from this area, uses others as mulch, and even lets his kids pick flowers for simple bouquets. His garden is no longer just a showpiece. It's a living, productive space that supports both people and wildlife. And he didn't have to spend a fortune to make it happen. He just changed his perspective. If this guide has helped you, write 1 in the comments. And if not, write 0. This way, I'll know which tips are most useful for your garden. Now let's talk about how to actually work with these plants in your own space. If you have a traditional garden, you don't need to let everything run wild. You can still have neat flower beds and vegetable patches while making room for useful weeds. One simple trick is to designate certain areas where these plants are welcome. Maybe it's a corner of the vegetable garden, a strip along the fence, or a small patch near the compost bin. In these areas, you can allow dandelions, plantain, chickweed, and others to grow and harvest them regularly. This way, they don't take over your main beds, but you still benefit from them. Another idea is to create a foraging garden or a wild food patch. This doesn't have to be big. Even a small raised bed or a few pots on a balcony can work. You can intentionally grow some of these useful plants like dandelions, purslane, or even nettles in a pot so they don't spread. This gives you a controlled source of edible greens and herbs, and it's a great way to learn how to grow and harvest them properly. Plus, it's fun to tell visitors, yes, that's a weed, and yes, I'm growing it on purpose. If you're worried about neighbours or visitors judging your messy garden, you can make it look intentional. Use simple labels like small wooden signs that say, edible greens, nature's medicine, or bee and butterfly food. You can also design the space so that the wild areas are framed by neat paths, borders, or decorative plants. This way, it looks like a thoughtful, natural garden, not a neglected one. And honestly, once people learn what you're doing, many of them become curious and even inspired to try it themselves. For those of you with balconies or small urban spaces, don't think this is only for big gardens. Many of these useful plants can grow in pots, window boxes, or even in cracks between paving stones. Dandelions, chickweed, and purslane are surprisingly adaptable. You can grow them in containers, harvest them regularly, and use them in your kitchen. Even a tiny balcony can become a mini foraging spot if you let a few useful weeds stay instead of removing them all. And let's not forget the medicinal side. Many of these plants have been used for generations as natural remedies. Plantain for cuts and stings, dandelion for digestion, nettle for joint pain, chickweed for skin irritations. The list goes on. I'm not saying you should replace proper medical treatment with herbs, but having a basic knowledge of these plants can be incredibly helpful for small, everyday issues. A simple plantain poultice, a cup of nettle tea, or a dandelion leaf salad can support your health in small but meaningful ways. Of course, not every weed is useful or safe. Some are truly invasive, some are toxic, and some simply don't belong in your garden. The key is learning to tell the difference. Start with a few well-known, safe plants. Dandelion, plantain, chickweed, purslane, nettle, and build your knowledge from there. Over time, you'll develop a feel for what's useful and what's best removed. And remember, gardening is a journey, not a race. You don't have to know everything at once. One last thing I want to share is the joy of rediscovering these old plants. There's something deeply satisfying about going outside, picking a few leaves from a plant that most people call a weed, and turning them into a delicious, healthy meal. It connects you to the land, to the seasons, and to the generations before us who lived in harmony with nature. It reminds us that we don't always need expensive, imported superfoods. Sometimes the best food is already growing right under our feet. So, next time you're in your garden and you see that annoying dandelion, that ugly plantain, or that invasive chickweed, pause for a moment. Look at it closely. Ask yourself, could this be useful? Could this be food? Could this be medicine? Could this be mulch or compost? And if the answer is yes, maybe it's not a weed at all. Maybe it's a forgotten friend, waiting to be welcomed back into your life. Thank you so much for spending this time with me here at Botanic Haven. I hope this little chat has given you some new ideas, some practical tips, and maybe even a bit of inspiration to look at your garden and the world around you in a slightly different way. Gardening isn't just about growing perfect flowers or spotless lawns. It's about growing a relationship with nature, learning from the past, and creating a space that's not only beautiful but also alive, useful and full of surprises. And if you're feeling a bit nervous about trying something new, that's totally okay. Start small, maybe just leave one dandelion in a quiet corner of your garden and watch how it grows, how the bees visit it, and how the leaves change through the season. Or pick a few young chickweed leaves for a salad, or dry a handful of plantain leaves for a simple tea. You don't need to turn your whole garden into a wild food forest overnight. Just take one step, then another, and let your garden teach you at its own pace. Over time, you'll start to see patterns. Which plants appear when, which ones come back every year, which ones the insects love, and which ones taste good in your kitchen. That's when gardening stops feeling like a chore and starts feeling like a real conversation with nature. I really hope this little chat has sparked something in you. A curiosity about the plants around you, a desire to grow more and waste less, or just a bit more peace with the idea that a perfect garden doesn't have to be perfectly tidy. Remember, Botanic Haven is always here for you, whether you're dealing with stubborn weeds, planning a new flower bed, or just wondering what that strange plant is in your pot. Keep growing, keep learning, and most of all, keep enjoying the simple joy of watching something green come to life right in front of your eyes. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and happy gardening.